much. And first of all, a huge thank you to the organizing committee. It's a real honor to be here, and it's great to see so many friends and to make so many new friends. So I'm going to talk a little bit about an emerging concept in the world of sports nutrition. It's a big change of topic compared to the last few, and that's around the purposeful interventions of nutrition from a temporal or timing perspective, or from a periodization perspective. So just in terms of background and conflict of interest, it's there. Here's some of the sponsors of my research over the years. I don't think it impacts my talk today, but to be really clear, my biggest conflict of interest is helping athletes perform better. And so that's the way I look at things. I'm going to spend a little bit of time setting up a framework for periodized nutrition that was just recently published, and then just give one example of a macro approach, a mezzo, and a micro approach to periodization of nutrition. And then talk a little bit about whether or not this actually happens already, perhaps by accident in athletes. So first, nutrition periodization, a framework. This is now published and is open access as of last month in the IJSNEM. And it's a framework that I was able to co-author with Louise Burke and James Morton, of which I'll now step you through. First of all, a training definition. There's lots of periodization definitions out there. Here's one of them. It is defined as a purposeful planning and sequencing of different training units, long, medium, and short, so the athletes can attain the desired physiological, I've put in, and psychological readiness for performances on demand. It can look many different ways, from whiteboards to fancy spreadsheets. About 10 years ago, I was involved with a few papers where we first started to explore the idea of nutrition periodization. And we defined it as initially used to describe changes in nutritional intake in responses to certain periods of training. And a more recent definition from Asker Jukendrup is again looking at planned, purposeful, and strategic use of very specific interventions to enhance adaptation. So at the root of periodization, or at the root of nutrition periodization, if we look at it in terms of a binary yin and yang approach, really what we're talking about at the simplistic level is energy expenditure and energy intake. In terms of training periodization, everyone will know there's amount or load, type, and timing. The exact same kind of approaches can be used with nutrition in terms of amount, type, and timing. And where the interaction of nutrition periodization occurs is here at the sweet spot between energy expenditure and energy intake. So you look at things like nutrition or recovery to optimize adaptation, look at it to optimize competition performance or body composition. And so it really stresses the point that nutritionists or registered dietitians have to really understand and work closely with physiologists and with coaches to understand the training periodization to optimize this interaction. So in a review that's out last month, we looked at the various steps and performance determinants that someone in nutrition should undertake. Jack LaLanne, a fitness guru in the 1950s in the US, was once quoted as saying, "Exercise is king, nutrition is queen, together they form a kingdom." And I think that order is important. I can eat all the protein in the world and sit on the couch. It's not going to work. So first and foremost, it's really important to understand the event or sport-specific determinants of success, from physiology to structural, neuromuscular to psychological determinants. Secondly, as best as we can measure, with validated measures, what are the individual athletes' gaps to these event or sports specific success determinants? Thirdly, what's the coach doing to try to address these gaps in terms of training periodization, from a mezzo, long-term, months, medium term, or weeks, or short term, how they program throughout the day. And then finally, step 4 is where you can start to think about what are the associated macro, mezzo, and micro periodized nutrition interventions that can support this training and recovery stimuli, or circumvent event-specific performance determinants. And so it's important to get this order correct. Sometimes we get the cart before the horse, and I think it's important to also realize that in nutrition, you need to engage the entire team to really understand the performance determinants. So for example, then, across macro and meso and micro, you can start to think about nutrition in different ways. So for example, with protein, from a macro perspective, at a certain heavy training block, we now know you need more daily protein per day during heavy training blocks compared to a recovery phase. However, there's a whole series of research as well looking at the within-day timing of nutrition to maximize full-day muscle protein synthesis. So that would be a micro or within-day protein periodization approach. For example, and I'll give you an example of this later, taking an iron supplement over 3 or 4 weeks at an altitude camp is incredibly important to optimize red blood cell mass adaptations while at altitude. So you can start to see the temporal ways that nutrition can help enhance adaptation and training. Another aspect that's important in building upon performance determinants, and again, this is a top-level overview, and we're talking about track and field across the various events. You're going to have more physiological determinants in the middle and long distance events, more neuromuscular and mechanical determinants in your sprints and jumps and throws. These are still highly relevant for long distance. And then a whole series of physiological or biomechanical constraints and or impactors across this continuum. But we can now start to layer in how nutrition impacts the various levels of the physiology. So from buffering capacity with sodium bicarb or beta alanine, depending on your fitness level, nitrates, looking at economy of movement, obviously hydration status, as Sebastian highlighted this morning with cardiac output, iron supplementation and hemoglobin at altitude. So there's a lot of different spots now where nutrition is showing to impact directly upon the various performance determinants. So as one maybe major theme, as I would recommend, is it's a great exercise to go through with your coach and your team to really drill into the performance determinants. And each person as part of the team can contribute to their part to optimizing these determinants. And so take the time and effort to understand those demands, individual athletes' gaps to the demands, and then create a performance determinants model. From this, you can prioritize and individualize your nutrition interventions to address the gaps in a periodized approach. So that kind of sets the stage a little bit on a model, and now I'll just give an example of macro periodization, meso, and micro. So macro, again, thinking about months to weeks. One area might just be in and around body composition periodization, or even the amount of calories that an athlete needs to take at different times of the year. My wife's a multi-time Olympian in the women's 1500. This is her data from over 12 years ago now of what she might look like at 140K a week in the fall, a 25-kilometer single session. At this time of the year, approximately 49 kilos and needs about 3,000 calories a day to stay in approximate energy balance. 6 months later, she has 5 races in 17 days across multiple continents. She's only running 60K a week at this point. The intensity of the training is very anaerobic, so that increases carbohydrate-fueled ATP production, which should also shift in carbohydrate intake. She's now at 46.5 kilos, and since she's only training 60K a week, she probably only needs around 2,000 calories. So it's pretty obvious when you look, this is the same athlete in a middle distance sport, 6 months apart, to think about the caloric and fuel requirements and how they shift throughout the year. And so back in 2007 and at the IAAF Nutrition Consensus, and then at the IOC Nutrition Consensus, a few of us put together a framework of looking at how changes in the training and competition focus across various training phases and what those requirements and needs are might dictate different requirements and needs for macronutrients, for caloric intake, for body composition periodization, et cetera, et cetera. This is all laid out in these publications, so I'm not going to go through every single phase, other than to say, if you don't know what your athletes are doing for their training intensities, you're at a huge disadvantage to understand what they're going to need for their nutrition. So last year, I published a paper on 9 years of body composition data, again on Hillary and how we approach that from a health perspective first and foremost, and then also from a performance perspective. Here's just a zoom in on what things might look like for her in peak competition phase versus the way her body composition will look like for the vast majority of the training year. I have an entire other talk just on this approach, but you can look at this case study. I think it's really important for our young athletes to realize that their heroes don't look like they always do at the Olympics. There is an off season for all of them, and if you want longevity in this sport, you better make sure that first and foremost athletes are healthy. I can also highlight she only had one major injury in her career, and that was after having a baby and her bone mineral density was low, and she was trying to get back to the Rio Olympics, which she did. So again, how do you make this come to life? Things like plates, in terms of macro periodization, your plate might look a little more like this if you're a middle distance athlete. In tapering or easy training days, it might look a little more like this. The major difference being the amount of grains or carbohydrate that you're adapting. In weight management, there's a fair amount of data suggesting slightly more protein is required to allow for optimal protein synthesis. So that gives you a little bit of a concept of a macro approach to nutrition and how it should shift and look throughout the year. So now we'll talk about a Mezzo approach to nutrition periodization, and I'll take on the topic of gut training for endurance runners who are using sports drinks in marathons, for example. And I'd say one of our best examples of gut training is back from 2010. That came out of the AIS, and they had two groups of athletes with 1 month of training. And during that training, one group had 100 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and the other group had none. And interesting, what they found, again, here's the groups in terms of carbohydrate oxidation during exercise pre-training, was the group that ingested carbohydrate throughout training had a 15% increase in carbohydrate oxidation and the ability to oxidize carbohydrates after consuming 100 grams of carbs in every single training bout. An indirect measure of enhanced gut uptake, as we suspect that the rate limiting step to carbohydrate oxidation is at the intestine, because if you bypass the intestine and infuse carbs in your arm, you can double the amount of carbohydrate oxidation. Another indirect evidence on whether guts or transporters are adaptable is this rodent study where the major glucose carbohydrate transporter is SGLT1, and they basically had rodents take on a low carbohydrate or high carbohydrate diet and basically showed a doubling of SGLT1 transporter in the gut, which resulted, a doubling of the SGLT1 transporter in the gut, which resulted in a doubling of glucose uptake across the gut. So again, over 2 weeks, again, it suggests that the gut transporters are adaptable leading into races. Finally, we know in just 5 runs that you can get improved GI outcomes in terms of just a psychosomatic scale and stomach comfort during 6 trials. So Here's an example of an intervention that's Mezzo in nature. It's a couple of weeks of duration. Certainly the endurance athletes I work with who are going to consume carbohydrates during their race, we definitely emphasize and increase carbohydrates during training in terms of sports drink and gels in the 2 to 3 weeks prior to major events. Finally, what about microperiodization? In this instance, I'm going to talk about iron and altitude. I've just actually flew here from Flagstaff. Every April, our Athletics Canada endurance athletes are there. And it's a wonderful opportunity to get ethics approval and run studies up there. And in 2015, out of Italy, there was a paper looking at daily single iron dosing versus split iron dosing. And basically the title says it all. Oral iron supplement increases hepcidin. Hepcidin blocks actually bioavailability of iron and decreases iron absorption from daily to twice daily. And so basically if you take iron multiple times a day, hepcidin increases as a negative feedback loop and drops the percent of iron bioavailability from about 20 to 10. And an increase in the amount of elemental iron in a subsequent dose decreased the next percentage of iron absorbed. It is important to note though, however, if your athletes are usually under a time constraint, the overall total iron absorbed is still higher with increased total iron intakes, but this may come at an increased GI side effect. So we basically looked at this daily, single dose daily versus split dose at altitude with our elite athletes. This is the condo we're in. We bring up an ABL 90. We had peat peeling involved, and we looked at iron dose, timing, hepcidin, erythroferrone, and obviously hypoxic stress. In this study, we had 26 elite athletes. This is now published as of a few months ago, over 3 weeks, and were assigned to one of 2 groups. We looked at HB mass, carbon monoxide rebreathe, ferritin, hepcidin, erythroferrone at the start and at the finish of 3 weeks. We had validated food frequency questionnaires, GI questionnaires, menstrual blood loss, and food iron intake questionnaires. And we had 2 groups. Both groups got the same amount of iron. One group had 100 milligrams in the morning and 100 milligrams at night. And the other group got a single dose of 200 milligrams of elemental iron just in the evening. And given the Moretti data, we hypothesized that this single dose group would be better, would result in better outcomes. And indeed, both groups increased hemoglobin mass. In 3 weeks, you should expect a 3 to 4% increase. However, the single dose group was slightly greater than the split group in terms of hemoglobin mass changes, again fitting with the Moretti data. So here's a micro intervention or a within day nutrition intervention showing just how you choose and when you choose to take your iron supplement could have outcomes on hemoglobin mass changes at altitude. I should note there are now a few studies at altitude showing 200 milligrams, somewhere probably between 150 or 200 milligrams of elemental iron is required to maximize hemoglobin mass responses. We have a paper, a sports med review on this coming out soon. Some people get a little bit nervous about that amount of elemental iron, and but you can see here that the changes pre to post in ferritin are still not excessive by any means. So I'll finish off and just say, at times does nutrition periodization already happen by accident? And it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek examination of the fact that I truly believe that a lot of innovations are already occurring by our coaches and by our athletes in the trenches. As a scientist, it takes us 2 to 3 years to figure something out sometimes, or even more. Good coaches are basically doing trial and error and doing scientific experiments all the time. And if you just observe closely and you observe consistently, you can get a lot of interesting inputs. For example, T Nation, it's not a website I go to often, but Testosterone Nation in 2002 was already talking about the anti-catabolic nighttime protein shakes where you could have cottage cheese, which is really high in casein. I'll also highlight that bodybuilder.com in 2005, we're talking about cottage cheese, and it has casein, which is a slow digesting protein. And yeah, some 15 years later at a Luc Van Loon's lab, again, 15 years later, protein ingestion before sleep improves post-exercise overnight recovery. So here's a micro periodization of protein right before bed that the bodybuilders had figured out 10 to 15 years before. You can get a lot of really good and bad ideas from T Nation, by the way. Or, you know, Rocky 1, 1976, him having his 5 a.m. Egg drink. He didn't separate the egg yolk from the egg whites. And in 2017, there's a paper that came out really well done using multiple tracers. Consumption of whole eggs promotes greater stimulation of post-exercise muscle protein synthesis than consumption of isonitrogenous amounts of egg whites. So again, Mother Nature knows what she's doing. Rocky in 1976 knew what he was doing. We're just catching up, well, yeah, almost 30 years later there. Finally, when I was in Switzerland, I helped have a conference as part of the IOC on sports nutrition. I was able to invite lots of friends, including Frank Shorter. And Frank Shorter had tons of great insights, tons of great wisdom on what he was doing in 1972 and 1976. They were doing fasted training. They were doing double sessions on low glycogen. But he also talked about the idea that he would open his Coke cans, put them in the fridge overnight, get the carbonation out of it, and use Coca-Cola as their sports drink in 72 and 76. Again, many years later in 2002, this came out of the Australian Institute of Sport. Coke obviously contains carbohydrate and caffeine, and they used Coca-Cola in this study and showed that the effect of caffeine was a 2% improvement in performance, and the effect of additional carbohydrate was 1%. Again, that's 2002, and he was doing this in 72 and 76 already. So again, with its nutrition, or whether it's S&C or biomech or whatever fields that you work in, I'd really strongly encourage all of you to spend a lot of time trackside, a lot of time in the environment that the coaches are in, and just observe, ask questions. You know, Marco's been quite articulate in saying how little we know about training loads across track and field. I believe Darwinistic pressure has optimized a lot of that, and we just now need to go back and figure out why. So in summary, I can finish a little bit earlier. I started with a performance determinants model at the start. However, for those of us that work in nutrition, how do you actually bring this to life with your athletes? How do you implement this with your athletes? How do you create cooperation or compliance? I may be biased. I think sports nutrition is probably the most complicated and nuanced of all the disciplines. There's at least 50 or 60 confounding factors on energy intake alone, and most of them are social and cultural. Who you sit with, your mood, who orders first, what they order first, all impacts on energy intake and the type of food selection that you have. So it's, you know, it's part soft skills, it's part hard skills, it's part and mostly about relationship building when you work in nutrition. And ultimately, I like this as a concept, 7 habits of highly effective people. You know, you need knowledge, you need skill, and you need a desire to create a new habit. In our world, I think you could say you're ready, willing, and able. And at least in nutrition, knowledge and whether or not you're ready comes from an expert source, hopefully with great education skills. And are we as practitioners able to effectively disseminate to athlete and coach to create a belief effect? In my career, I feel like I've done a good job here. I haven't done as good a job here at times in terms of implementation. Because a lot of times you can have athletes with tons of education, but they have really poor skills. Can they actually execute the knowledge? Cooking classes? Can they go to the grocery store and shop? If you're dealing with junior athletes, you probably need the parents at all your education sessions as well, because at home that the structure is they're preparing the foods. And then obviously the desire and are they willing? Personal commitment to ownership or change, or you can't beat a dead horse. So that's what I have for today. Thank you very much for being here, and again, thank you so much for having me at this conference. Thank you.